Good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming. It's been a wonderful collaboration. I think it's been a year and a half now or so. So we're happy it's getting somewhere. Today it's not about us. It's more about Graciela Carnevale and the incredible work she's been doing with the Archiva de Artista Vanguardia. It's more about Sneha Ragavan and the incredible work they've been doing with the Asian Art Archive. It's more about Thokozani Mhlambi, who can't be with us today for several reasons we'll also talk about. But by way of introduction of these people, we will say one or two words or read from an excerpt, we'll read an excerpt of what we've been doing in the past years, a conversation we've been having in the past years about archives, or the lack thereof. Because we are from a space called Savvy Contemporary, we are interested in both the archive and the theories of the archive, because we are a laboratory of form ideas. So we do both. The fundamental questions to us are, who has the right to memory? Which must be understood as, who has the right to govern memory? To choose what is to become public memory? And how should it become? Public, because in the etymology of the word archive, the archaea and the archae mean public records and government, respectively. Who has the right to record and be recorded? That is, who has the right to be in public memory? How and in what way does one appear, as in become existent in that space of public memory? If then, how much and for how long? Which is again to say, how can one imagine the non-immortality, the non-infinity, the non-totality, and the non-totalitarianism of the archive? How can one reimagine an archive not as a collection of historical documents, but as a collection of non-localized, maybe individual records and memories? And B, how can we imagine other carriers of what can be called the archive? The embodied, the sonic, and other vulnerable archives. Maybe one of the biggest challenges of a small institution like ours, especially an institution that is constantly in the becoming, that is to say, perpetually interrogating what an institution can, is, should be, or not be, is the question of the archive and archiving. By that I mean, on the one hand, the notion and infrastructure of the archive, on the other hand, the processuality and the performativity of archiving. These issues become a challenge, as it might be, for the mere banal reason of possibilities or abilities, and obviously the lack thereof, to document and to sustain an archive. Thinking of notions and infrastructures of archive have been at the core of our practice for many years now. The Savvy Doc, which you heard about yesterday, the archive which accommodates rare cultural, political publications from around the world, colonial neighbors, which you also heard about yesterday, an archive that is a host for objects, words, anecdotes, and other traces of German colonial histories, the performance archive that deliberates on possibilities of archiving the ephemeral, the film archive we have that seeks to display that which is chiseled out of a film before it gets on the silver screen. And last but not least, the archive of events and exhibitions we have at Savvy Contemporary for the past 10 years in forms of videos and sounds. Due to the obvious limitations of such an institution, such a small institution for that matter, especially financially and in terms of human resources, one is forced to use open source archiving facilities and social media. That's where we are. But 2 years ago, our complete archive, including images, videos, pictures of the past 10 years that we deposited on Facebook as a kind of an archiving platform, was hacked, and we lost most, if not everything. Instead of lamenting on the proverbial spilled milk, this hacking and loss have prompted us to think even more about the vulnerability and the fragility of archives, as well as the mortality and the uneternity of the archive. The thesis is that if there can be a living archive, then death must be an active part in the reflection of notions of this archive. But one must even push it further. The idea of a death of an archive must not be understood as something that happens par hasard, or that means the end of an archive, but the concept of the death of an archive should be understood in the lines of the possibility of death or dying so as to make life. More than a decade and a half ago, working in a laboratory as a biotechnologist, researching on chronic myelogenous leukemia, I was confronted with the concept of apoptosis. Put simply, apoptosis, which etymologically comes from falling off, is a process of programmed cell death in multicellular organisms. A popular example for apoptosis is the dying of cells that keep the fingers of an embryo together. So we have our fingers like this because of apoptosis. If not, they would be like this. Apoptosis is a regulated and controlled process that is indeed advantageous to the life cycle of the organism in question. Apoptosis might be triggered intrinsically or extrinsically, that is upon stress from within or from without. It's also not to be mistaken with necrosis. And like every other process in life, apoptosis makes sense only to a certain level, as too much apoptosis leads to atrophy, and too little apoptosis leads to excessive cell proliferation and thus cancer. I would like to use this analogy of an induced regulated cell death to think of what we would like to call the apoptotic archive. The idea of the apoptotic archive would mean an archive that controlledly and regulatedly destroy its part to be able to sustain its whole. But before we zoom into what might that really mean, it's important to reflect a bit more on the fragility and the vulnerability of the notion and infrastructures of archives.
As Bonaventure introduced before, we've been part of the reflections that led, and the dialogues and discussions that led to this conference and in order to come for quite some time. And we've been playing a lot, actually, with this notion of apoptosis and what it may mean, actually, if positioned in a different context. And something that we came to think about was how this notion of induced and regulated death, or maybe just in thinking about death when thinking about the life of archives, is that it might speak of an innate feature of actually small institutions' archives, and maybe even small institutions in general. So, in a sense, the need to destroy part of what they produce in an effort to survive. For the small players, for the fragile, vulnerable ones, for the plankton, as Maria Lent once beautifully put it, what stays, what remains, is only the essential. That without which one would stop existing. So the selection of what may remain within their archives could be thought of as following a sort of strange Darwinian existential logic. And something else that then we were thinking about in this sort of train of thought was about their temporality. The fragility of the infrastructure that holds those more vulnerable archives together, no matter the size, is often in a state of relative danger. In most cases, surviving thanks to one or just a few more individuals and essentially following the life path of these individuals quite arbitrarily. Hence, these archives remain intricately and intimately attached to these individuals, the people who, out of personal will, decide to take on their survival. This has meant that in many cases, archives got lost, rotten, divided, fragmented, or even inadvertently destroyed, including for reasons related to natural deterioration or the lack of infrastructure that could appropriately conserve them. Now, in the context in which we live, which has been brought up already quite a few times, dominated by the internet, social media, and the digital world, the digital environment, of course, the possibilities of archiving have immensely expanded, even for individuals and small organizations like us. Everyone has become a kind of archiver, we could say, or has been said before. So social media, blogs, all sorts of clouds, in essence, represent one of the cheapest and simplest forms of archiving and of distributing and disseminating information. However, as the hacking that Bonaventure mentioned just before and revealed to us extremely concretely, is their fragility, the fragility of these archives is disarming. An archive built and slowly constructed in years completely disappeared in just a few minutes. The digital, in this sense, coexists with the constant possibility of disappearance. And what we went through in this sense also testifies how its retrieval heavily depends also on national legislations and essentially on economic power, which I think is very important to talk about here for us as well. The long court cases we would have needed to go through to have back our materials were simply something an organization of our size and with our scale and our means could not afford. And this, of course, speaks to many more forms of injustice over property, ownership, crediting, appropriation, etc. And an important question for us right now is about also finding new digital infrastructures in this sense to use that are both affordable, sustainable in terms of cost and of labor force needed to keep them and to grow with them, and complex enough to make hacking at least a harder endeavor. Now, on the other hand, I wanted to quote someone, namely Kenneth Goldsmith, who, among other things, is actually the founder of UbuWeb. Something he interestingly talks about, which is that we may stop also thinking about disappearance when thinking about digital archives, and instead think about the notion of transformation in relationship to digital archiving. He makes a comparison between digital cells, to go back to apoptosis, and the way in which James Joyce writes about water. And I quote here, "Speaking of the way water puddles and collects in its variety of forms and loughs and bays and gulfs, I am reminded of the process whereby data rains down from the network in small pieces when I use a BitTorrent client, pulling in my download folder. When the download is complete, the data finds its solidity in glaciers, icebergs, ice flows, as a movie or a music file at the end," end of quote. Now, do we think of transformation, of death for life, of induced death? but also on how life forms may get distributed and disseminated differently from the very beginning of our archival practices. And this is a question we have asked to our speakers. And also, how does that actually influence the form we decide to give to our archives today? Now, one last point I would like to bring is related also to why I think it is paramount to actually think about new sustainable forms of archiving for small organizations, because this is also what we're really looking into. As is obvious, most of their work is not archived nor recorded, and this means that very often it's very easy not to feature those stories into narratives of the present and of the future. Moving beyond the now relatively fetishized celebration of impermanence and lack of durability as a form of resistance to commodification, I think we need to instead to consider the implications that disappearance and a certain type of transformation that might lead to disappearance and impermanence have and had in the way history is written, and hence its major influence on how we may perform the present and imagine the future. We know that strong players have the capacity, the size, the means, the power to historicize themselves and write themselves into history. Archives being a fundamental tool for providing forensic evidence of their existence, their work, their programs, etc. Hence, to strengthen the fragile and vulnerable archive means to believe and care for the need of a more rhizomatic writing and understanding of our past and how our present will shift towards the future. This also brings us back to the need for thinking about who retains the power over vulnerable archives, and hence what type of tools can be developed that could allow for their self-management and self-determination, not to mention conservation. As we know, in fact, many fragile and vulnerable archives have been incorporated or dislocated to other geographical locations or larger and stronger institutions. I'll stop it here because I think this gives already enough of a sense of what types of questions we want to engage with here, but also on which premises we actually invited our speakers. I'm extremely honored to introduce the first speaker, Graciela Carnevale, who has been engaging with some of these reflections already since the 60s, and whose work has actually deeply influenced the way I look at exhibition and exhibition making as a curator. In fact, in the 60s, Graciela Carnevale was part of the Grupo de Artistas de Vanguardia in Argentina, a group of artists who famously worked with the CGT of Rosario, which was an Argentinian labor union formed by workers, artists, and intellectuals. And what they did was basically interventions in mass communication, generating a circuit of counter-information about the situation in Tucumán particularly, that opposed that of the dictatorship in Argentina, while political parties, education policies, and the mass media were strictly controlled, dominated, and censored by the government. Within this, she participated in the now very famous series of actions called or known through the name Tucumán Arde, pushing all possible boundaries in relationship to audience participation and engagement, and in relation to activist and politicized art fighting against injustice. And it is thanks to her that we actually still know about the history of this group, as the archive of what the group has achieved, in many cases ephemeral actions, is still archived in her own apartment. Of course, I will leave Graciela to speak more about it. I just want to mention that also in 2003, she organized with Mauro Machado El Levante, which is also an independent platform, for research and the production of critical knowledge from situated artistic practices. And through this platform, she has collaborated in a number of different collectives. And she's also a member of the Red de Conceptualismo del Sur. Yeah, we'll introduce Sneha, and then we have both of you here.
So if you find yourself in Hong Kong, you of course have to go to the Asian Art Archive, you know, even if you have just 24 hours. Sneha is part of this archive in the larger sense. Sneha Ragavan is a senior researcher and leads projects of Asian Art Archive in India based in New Delhi. She conceptualizes and leads research initiatives on modern and contemporary art, has led projects digitizing artists' archives, creating digital bibliographies of art across multiple languages, and has co-organized with colleagues at the Asian Art Archive seminars, workshops around archiving and educational resources. I'll read a few words about the Asian Art Archive, you know, because this is something that, you know, for me personally, has been very interesting to see in the past years, also in the context of how one can imagine such a thing for the African continent in terms of artistic practices, and met some of the founders of the Asian Art Archives to see how also they raise funds to make that happen, you know, because that doesn't happen without money. Asian Art Archives is an independent non-profit organization which was initiated in 2000 with the intent to document and make accessible the multiple histories of art in the region. It is both a digital archive with much of its collection available online from its website and has an on-site library. The Asian Art Archive also gears itself to be much more than a static repository gathering dust, waiting for the scholar to unearth and discover materials. One of the driving forces behind making this possible is the notion, what I find extremely important, and I think she will talk about that, of preservation through dissemination. How do the bodies that encounter these archives carry these knowledges with them? It implies that the dissemination of archival materials through the research projects or public programs that they initiate will encourage more access and use, and in turn contribute to their preservation in cultural history and memory. So the third person who couldn't come, we'll say a bit about him, Thokozani Mhlambi, who's a postdoctoral fellow in South Africa and a musician himself. So we actually wanted to invite him to talk about using sonicity as a space of archiving, you know, looking into histories that are embedded in sonic practices, looking at ways of dealing with archives that are not easily accessible for those who are not initiated. Unfortunately, he couldn't come because the organization couldn't pay him enough money, so he turned down 2 days ago. We need to talk about these things as well. If somebody is flying from South Africa to spend a couple of days here, how much can we afford to pay that person? So he's not here with us, but his ideas are here with us. We hope to talk about them during the conversation.
Let's give a warm welcome, because actually we have 2 speakers that come from really, really far and are also here. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia, for your words, and thank you all for coming here. This presentation is based on my own personal experience in the construction, preservation, and reactivation of an archive, and in multiple readings, dialogues, and practices, together with many artists and non-artists. I'll try to make visible the fragilities and vulnerabilities of some particular kind of archives. I was part of the avant-garde art group of Rosario in the 60s. As the press responsible, I kept photos, documents, and journalist articles related to the group as part of a collective memory. After the dissolution of the group, we abandoned artistic production. In the following years, I continued to add documents and information about events related to repression and torture in Latin American contexts in the 70s, when dictatorial military regimes imposed their policies by force, repressing popular demonstration, abolishing political parties, suppressing human rights, and exercising censorship in the most diverse forms. This archiving activity has been continuous since then. This archive consists of written documents, slides, photographs, negatives, correspondence, postcards, posters, newspapers, CDs, DVDs, catalogs, and publications, mainly from the late 60s and 70s. The main core are the mentioned funds linked to the joint production of the group. Likewise, it brings together a set of materials from the socio-political and cultural contexts in which these productions were created, the successive readings on those sources that gave rise to exhibitions, articles, and publications. It includes documentary backgrounds of those years and recent productions related to the practice of a critical art that aims to intervene on its context. Part of the material that is preserved is unique and historically important to Argentinian and Latin American art and culture because other documents were destroyed or are lost, as is evidenced by some crossing contributions that have taken place among archives in Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. That is the case, for example, of the documentation of the artists' meetings in Chile and Cuba in 72 and 73. Although an incipient archive was gestating to the rhythm of the activities of the group, and after it became broader documentary collection, a series of circumstances brought it into light. During the repressive period, these documents were kept scattered and camouflaged in my parents' house. Then they were transferred to my home, and finally, in 2016, they were located in a small flat exclusively dedicated for the archive. A first organization of the material began in the framework of the return of democracy in 1984, under the need to present background in a teaching context at the university. However, it was the encounter with some curators and researchers interested in artistic practices of the late 60s, such as Maricarmen Ramirez and Ana Longoni, that enabled greater visibility to these documents. While the meeting with Ana in the mid-90s prompted a new organization of the materials, acquiring an archival identity, the visit of Maricarmen Ramirez to curate the exhibition Global Conceptualism gave an international visibility. Also, in the framework of the preparation of Ex-Argentina in 2002, an important work of reflection, organization, and digitalization of documents was developed and continued in the following years. During the last 2 decades, this archive has been the input of several researches, publications, exhibitions, and critical writings made both in Argentina and in different countries. The circulation of some of the documents, mainly those related to Tucumanarde, motivated to be acknowledged as the Tucumanarde Archive. This archive has acquired significant visibility in recent years due to some peculiarities that characterize it. It is one of the first files that is constituted in relation to practices that occurred during the military governments in Latin America, which in recent years have been recovered and put into visibility. It is also the only documentary collection of that itinerary of radicalization and politicization of art practices occurred in our country in the 60s. Its very existence constitutes an act of resistance, but also a demonstration of vulnerability. It is an archive that is continuously being modified with the incorporation of new materials, including those of its own circulation. The documents make visible a network of stories and historical facts that allow an approach to the problems of those moments. According to how and from where they are questioned, they can have different interpretations. This critical and vital awareness of the archive prevents us from considering it as something closed and univocal. This personal archive that has its origin in particular historical moment has a collective dimension, not only because it refers to a group, but also because of the very dynamics with which it was built, with the participation of those who materially contributed to it or has collaborated in its organization. Documents and images, publications and photographs that were left for many years hidden until the establishment of democracy, when the first questions began to raise about those actions that had been silenced and made visible under the dictatorships of the 60s and 70s, witnesses of an emancipatory utopia that demanded commitment. Real possibilities of transformation that took place in the streets with the participation of thousands of citizens that in the following year gave rise to the fights and events of the Rosariazo and the Cordobazo, incipient and ephemeral triumphs that sealed the alliance between workers and students, of which we now commemorate 15 years. The first of Eduardo Ruano's action, known as The Attempt, recently found by his niece under the linen and the covers of a book, who has just brought us a copy to the archive. This action is mentioned as the beginning of the itinerary of 68. Until now, only verbal stories of the event were known, or images of the broken vitrine with the image of Kennedy. None of the installation and at the none of the action itself when the artist took up a stone that was left on the floor as part of the installation, and at the cry, "Go away, Yankees from Vietnam," throw it to the glass, breaking the window, turning what seemed a homage to Kennedy into a disturbing action. In the second image, the moment of the action is not registered, but only the result. A broken window through which the audience leaves its confinement. The photo belongs to the proposal that I made for the experimental art cycle that consisted in locking the audience inside the exhibition space. We can consider both acts as two moments of the process that would give rise to Tucumán Arde as a collective proposal of action and intervention into the social. Attempt and confinement, two broken windows, two disruptive violences, a movement of the hand and a kick, the bodies of artists and public involvement, both protagonists of a gesture of violence that challenges the statu quo of art and society. One work that opens a perspective, the other that closes it to give place to other experiences which deeply relate art to life. Coincidences, embutes of memory, hidden disguised places which appear illuminated the present, records of an instant, of a present and a void, ruptures, hidden photos and documents that sometimes arise by surprise in the middle of other searches, erasures imposed by force, but that nevertheless obstinately, stubbornly appear. Files born vulnerable, anchored to the vicissitudes of their own conditions in times of struggle and resistance in the personal, political, and social. Images and documents that could not get rid of because they crossed us in the search for new ways of life. The anecdotes and micro stories in relation to these documents and personal dimensions these documents add personal dimensions to the archive that become significant when thinking on vulnerability, as for example, knowing that Norberto, destroyed everything related to the group for fear of police raids, or that Jose Maria buried his books and papers in cans in his garden before going into exile, and then, when returning after more than 30 years and unearthing them, the humidity has done its job and destroyed everything. That the soldiers cut through and destroyed the paintings that Eduardo had hung in the house he lived with his companion of militancy. That the Caesar's lights went and returned from Buenos Aires to my house several times, first with the frames and then stripped in small packets packed in an envelope. That the films and murals of Thokozani that Ruben kept in his workshop were destroyed in a flood and others were lost. That I myself had to destroy documents in order to preserve persons, taking the decision to save only only what had been public, and destroying records that I had taken on my discussions that were given within the group. Issues that signify not only that what has been saved, but also what is missing in the archive. What is not in the archive account to the vulnerability of these collections and also for their precarious and hazardous existence. Many of these archives have been preserved by their owners, sometimes in poor conditions, packed in boxes full of dust, and other times lovingly kept, waiting for the moments to become visible. Files that speak when their owners relate the experiences that took place in those times, the struggles, the ideals, the discussions, the dilemmas that appear in the debates that contaminated the life experiences of their protagonists. Utopia and reality of our imaginary then, and strands of what remains of those broken dreams that nevertheless interrogate us in the present. I think there is a disruptive power in these files that make us think of the possibility. They urge us to come out of an imposed paralysis, to look for other roads that allow us to imagine other possible worlds. Personal files, as well as collective, that keep the memory of other moments where the present was questioned under a revolutionary utopia that confronted the authoritarian and repressive military governments that ravished our countries. There are other vulnerabilities that affect these archives that have to do with the law, with intellectual property, and individual and collective rights. Vulnerabilities today due to the pressures of the market that tend to plunder the peripheral countries of these archives, taking them from their places of origin, concentrated them in the centers of power, often fragmenting them, decontextualizing them, fetishizing them, transforming these files into appreciated praise. Cultural and patrimonial exploitation constitutes another form of extractivism of global capitalism that imposes itself in a new colonization that is more subtle and obscene than the other narrations and policies. Importance in this perspective, the responsibility of our own governments and institutions that do nothing to value and retain these funds. These circumstances urge us to think collectively of other strategies from the institutional, legal, and socially to act on different scales before the increasingly brutal market advance towards the privatization of these archives. The action of preserving is an affirmation that stands against the impermanence and the disappearances to which we are daily confronted. Preserving was an act of resistance at a time when forgetting or destroying became an act of preserving. What's the point of saving these archives? What to do when the protagonists die? Who will tell their stories? What institutions will want to take care of them without turning them into corpses stored in more or less technological coffins? How to keep these voices alive? The question is not only about preserving our files, but about creating strategies to keep them alive, open to consultations, allowing them to circulate, exposing them and forming part of other discourses that establish disruptive relationships with the present, and being able to discovering the transgression, subversions, and complicities that the archives keep. What to do then? How to preserve them in their places of origin and at the same time keep its use value? How we talk about the sustainability of personal files? Archives that we must necessarily think about in a possible transition towards their institutionalization under some kind of physical or digital format as the only way to preserve them and make their socialization possible. The digitalization that one time was considered as the solution for the issues of preservation and circulation of the archives today is questioned by the same technology. The digital versions coexist with the constant threat of disappearing or getting lost. Documents needed a context to show layers of meanings. A file is just a fragment of a much more complex reality. It is never complete. It is always unfinished. Archives related to their social context make other imaginings and other maps possible. They allow us to build relationships that transform a fact, a work, a document into an event with the power to affect, to produce critical thinking, to mobilize. Archiving is a situated practice that has taken different modalities in recent years. Its role is not only to answer questions, but also and mainly to create new ones from which to address the documents and history. It can be understood as an aesthetic experience, a transforming practice, a research method that allows to incorporate critical knowledge based on different perceptions of the world. How to exhibit a file? How to unfold historical time and contemporary interpellations? Reactivating the files means recovering the ability of the experience to affect us. Nowadays, archives are battlefields in the struggle to the political use of memory. An archive is a creation, a construction of meaning through the organization, dissemination, and ways of showing its materials. We may consider the role of the archive as a powerful act of construction and an exercise of permanent reflection. The archives have the power to generate relationships and activate these collections as part of interdisciplinary practices. However, the fragility of the infrastructure that sustains them means that they are always in a state of permanent danger. Thinking about the possible ways of sustainability of this type of files is crucial to its continuity. They often survive thanks to someone who commits to its preservation, but this is not enough. This situation leads to the loss of or damage to files because of the precariousness or lack of infrastructure that houses them. The will to conserve the archive in Rosario in its geographical context of production is a political decision coincident with the archive policies defended by the Red de Conceptualismo del Sur, of which I have been part since its inception. This group fights to the visualization and activation of archives, promoting their correct conservation, avoiding fragmentation, and supporting their free public disposition. It has created Archivos en Uso, a web platform with free access. We can conceive the archive as a toolbox with use value in the present. By recovering memories and experiences from more than 50 years ago, the archive makes disputing contemporary artistic and political practices visible, and it invites us to reactivate the memories of those actions that were disrupted and that until recently had no entity. It challenges new uses and interpretations of its materials and to explore ways of reactivating poetical political practices arising in repressive government to think about what would be the radical overflows in the present. The addition of a selection of material of the archive is our present economic source of sustainability of nowadays. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Thanks also to Antonia and Bonaventure for thinking of the Asia Art Archive to be a part of this panel. And thank you to Graciela. I mean, I could have just gone on listening to you for longer. It was such a beautiful presentation and such an inspiration to see the work that you do. I'd like to start by introducing myself, although Bonaventure has already done so. I'm a researcher with an organization called Asia Art Archive. It was founded in the year 2000 in Hong Kong, and founded with the mandate to document and digitize recent histories of art in the region. By region, of course, I'm referring to Asia. Asia, of course, is rather large. And so at the archive, we've had several discussions about what it means when we say that we are Asia Art Archive. And we like to think of ourselves as questioning every single word in our title. What is Asia? What is art? And what is archive? And now, as with every archive or institution, we also have an origin story or a legend. And we're just nearing 20 years old. But in the late 1990s, Claire Su, who is our founder director, she was actually doing her master's at SOAS. And as part of her master's dissertation, she was looking at contemporary Chinese art. Now, for her research, as part of this dissertation, when she went back to China and Hong Kong, she realized that there were really no publicly accessible collections for people interested in pursuing research on contemporary Chinese art. Now, of course, you would find museums and archives dedicated to, let's say, ink painting or earlier forms of art practice, but for contemporary Chinese art, that began, let's say, from the 1980s onwards, there was really no publicly accessible collection. So Asia Art Archive actually started in the year 2000 as a room which had 2 bookshelves. And over the years, it has grown. And we are now a team of about 35 odd people working in the organization. we have a physical library in Hong Kong, but we also have researchers who work on artist archives and other archives from different parts of Asia. More recently, we also have 2 small spaces. We have Asia Archive in India, which is based in New Delhi, which is where I work. And we also have Asia Art Archive in America, which is based in Brooklyn, New York. As, again, they already mentioned, the idea behind the archive was not to build it as a static collection and wait for scholars to come and pull material out there. The archive from the outset was conceptualized as, sort of the collections were thought of alongside a robust sort of series of programs that would help activate these collections. We are independent, nonprofit, and a digital archive. All of these 3 things are very important for us. It is very important that we stay independent so that we have complete control over what we decide to digitize, to bring into the archive. We are nonprofit, and one of the things that we do through the work that we do at the archive is to ensure that everything we put online, everything we collect, is accessible freely to anybody. And we are digital primarily because it just ensures that even if we are collecting material on, say, India or Pakistan, somebody sitting anywhere can actually access it online. It does not mean that one has to travel all the way here, to actually research all of this material, which is kind of ironical because until now, a lot of the material, for instance, in the context of Asia, is actually found in a lot of Europe and American institutions. So a lot of students actually pursuing higher education in Asia, looking at contemporary art from Asia, would actually have to go to Europe or to America to actually study a lot of this material because this was actually available in libraries and archives there. And obviously, it does take a lot of work to keep us independent, to keep us non-profit, and a lot of resources to keep this a digital archive. And I can talk about it in more detail in the discussion if they'd like. Now, the context from which I work more specifically in the context of India is again very similar to what led to the founding of the archive, which is the absence of publicly accessible and available collections for anybody interested in researching 20th century or 21st century visual art. Now, of course, there are libraries where you will find books, but these books very often will be in English, whereas India, as one may know, has at least 22 officially recognized languages, but otherwise understood to be a country which has over 700 languages, right? So what about all the writing on art that goes on in all of those languages? So it's now a couple of things have happened as a result of this lack or absence of having publicly accessible materials. The first is that both academic institutions, art historians, and critics have had a huge say in building up, the canons of art history. And so in India, for instance, you have a very sort of a very clear and a linear narrative of 20th century art history, right? And that is the same set of artists, the same set of artistic movements that get written about and researched about time and time again. The second thing that happens when one does not have publicly accessible archival materials, and by archival materials, of course, I'm referring to, whether it's correspondences, exhibition catalogs, photographs, et cetera, what happens is that the artwork becomes the site of analysis, right? That's the only thing people have access to is the image of the artwork. And so that becomes something that you keep, analyzing, right? And should one actually have access to some of this archival material, it's only because of personal connections, right? I know somebody and therefore I can go to their home and access this material. Now, this is something we realized there was a huge discrepancy between what people had in their homes and what were available publicly. And therefore, personal archives became a very sort of important resource and a source of material for us to put out there. So at the Asiad Archive, one of the sort of primary sites which, that we focus on digitizing or bringing to light are personal archives of artists, of writers, of critics, and so on. What do some of these personal archives look like, right? They may look like this. And I mean, don't let the image fool you. There is a very clear organizational structure here as well. They could look like this as well. It looks organized, at least compared to the previous image. But really, when you start looking into all the alphabets and the numbers, it's something for us to actually decrypt, right? And this is something we actually are, we learn a lot from. We're very inspired by how artists and individuals actually maintain and keep their own archives. Not just what they decide to keep and what they decide to throw, but what are the systems and structures that they use to keep their own archives. Because unlike public collections, when artists decide to keep archives, the person, and an important function of archives is not merely to collect, but it is to be able to retrieve. Right? And when people keep archival collections in their homes, the intended audience for that is themselves, right? So it's actually very interesting for us to see how different artists, different individuals in the field find their own sort of systems and structures of classification and just keeping all of this material. It's something we learn from a lot. And now, of course, one of the things that, forms part of the, let's say, starting point for why we decide or how we decide whose archive to digitize, whose, archive to collect. Of course, the question of urgency, fighting against sort of loss, that some material might be thrown away in the trash. These are extremely important, of course, but if we keep those as the only parameters, there are too many archives that are in danger of being lost, right? So at the archive, and the other sort of mandate that we work with very, very clearly is we do not want to, and we do not have the capacity to be an archive of everything, It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to actually build each of these archival collections. Even with regard to the artists whose archives we digitize, we do sort of try and have certain boundaries. Otherwise, so there was this, this is actually a joke. There was this artist whose archive we were digitizing, and somebody said, "Oh, but what about the books he reads? Those are as inspiring for him. If you're actually digitizing that artist's archive, you may want to sort of, look at the books that he reads." And then we were like, "Okay, but the food that he eats also inspires him. How do we bring that into the archive now?" So at the archive, we have to sort of, as much as we would like to sort of bring in everything, we're very clear that there are certain parameters by which we work, and that's really the only way that we can sort of make it an archive and not a collection dump. This is also a way for us to arrive at certain frameworks. When we put archives out there, we like to frame them and put them out there. And this, the frameworks include not just of past context, of providing people a sense of context within which artists worked, but it's also about thinking about context of the present that drive us to looking at certain artists. It is also thinking about what possible sort of research this can facilitate in the future, which also forms part of our sort of selection process. Internally, we call this our content priorities. So areas of research that we feel as an archive, at least for the time being, maybe for the coming, let's say, 5 more years. These are some of the areas that we are interested in sort of looking at. So you can see here a couple of them. These, and they're quite a range, including from art writing and exhibition histories through to pedagogy. Let me give you an example of one of the content priorities that we work with. It's performance art. And performance art, as I think has already emerged in some of the discussions before, one of the things about performance art is, of course, that it is ephemeral. Very often it has resisted archiving itself. It is all about the here and the now. So what can a document or an archive even capture, right? I mean, this has been something that has been much discussed about performance art. But at the same time, something that we think a lot about is how is it that we are able to recall a lot of performances that we may never have seen? How is it that sitting in India, we all know about Yoko Ono? How do we know about Marina? We know about all of their works only because we've seen them through images. We've seen their videos, they're online. We've seen their images reproduced in magazines and periodicals that we found in art schools. And therefore, clearly the document, the photograph, the image, the archive seems to play some role as well in the way that we see or we access performance art. And in that sense, it comes to us as mediated, right? So performance art is actually one of those areas that interests us a lot. Secondly, also because in the context of Asia, particularly in the context of Southeast Asia, performance art is actually an extremely sort of, it has many significant political overtones. And is something that, for instance, presents sort of moments of sort of confrontation with the state. And therefore, for us, it is also an equally important sort of form of practice to explore. And as part of course, engaging with something like performance art, what we do is to not merely it also presents challenges to us in terms of archiving itself. What do you archive, or how do you build an archive of performance art? Is it just photographs? Is it videos? Can we think about, who do we approach for videos or photographs? Is it only the artists themselves, or is it audiences as well? What about audience testimonies about recollecting how they experienced the photograph? The question of rights also becomes really interesting here. What if an artist did not want to sort of document the performance, but audiences documented them? Do we get to sort of still build an archive of, let's say, a performance artwork, even if the artist refused to hand over documentation of it? Is it still, the question of ethics, the question of all of these things emerge. And so one of the things that we actually started doing programmatically, and in the context of India particularly as well, since one does not have too many resources in the form of books or essays or even images for that matter of performance art, one of the things we did was a series of programs called Memory Acts, where we would invite one performance artist to sort of retell the story of how they came across the work of another performance artwork that inspired them a lot, right? And so in the hopes that, this sort of recording of this retelling would itself become then a resource or a document. Another area that has been of huge importance for us is pedagogy. It's to look at art schools, and particularly to look at the role of artistic experimentation within art schools. So for instance, in the context of India, we actually looked at the work of 4 artists who were educators and instrumental in setting up a post-independent Indian institution known as the Faculty of Fine Arts. The institution was set up with a very clear mandate to sort of to develop a curriculum that was opposed to the colonial art school model. And so for us, these art educators and so the various sort of curriculums and so on that they developed became extremely important sites. The other thing that we sort of came across as part of this archive, and this is again very interesting, is that the Faculty of Fine Arts, which is the institution in Baroda that we were looking at, the faculty had its own archive. And what's interesting is this is an archive of copies, right? So the professor and the head of the art history department who set up the archives, he visited, I think he visited the Courtauld, and where he came across, I think, a collection of materials on Russian art. And he came across these in the form of clippings. And he decided that this would be a feasible sort of way that one could build an archive back in India, where access to images of art from around the world were also very limited. So what he did was to write a letter to the university librarian saying, can we please order 3 copies of magazines like Span and, all of these magazines coming out of Europe. He said 3 copies. 1 will remain in the library, but the other 2, we would like to cut out images that were there in these periodicals. And 2 copies because, just in case one image was printed on one side and another image was printed on the other side, right? And the way that he went about rationalizing this to the university librarian was to say, think of it the way that a chemist orders like material, right? They use it for an experiment and then it just disappears, right? It's just useless, right? So think of it that way. Don't think of it as us destroying books. Think of it as us building an archive, right? So this was basically an archive. And the amazing thing about this archive was that till date, it continues to be used in classroom teaching in the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda. And so these are sort of some amazing documents and stories and things like that we found as part of such research. Another sort of area, for instance, of interest to us is innovation through tradition. Now, one of the sort of key sort of areas that developed as a site of conflict in 20th century, sort of modernism sort of context in India for sure, but in large parts of Asia, was how to deal with tradition. As we become sort of modern subjects, do we leave it aside or do we try and engage with it? And much of the history of modernism, be it in art, be it in literature, in a lot of Asia, has been about how to engage with tradition. In Baroda, the school that I was just talking about previously, there was actually a movement that developed which is called Living Traditions of Indian Art. Now, this was actually a movement started by artist teachers, and the idea being that in order to be a modern artist, a truly Indian modern artist, one could not leave behind all of the work that was, that had been going on for a long time, but continued even to date. These were not dead traditions, but these were very much living. And as part of that, every single artist and art student was encouraged to go out there, study, document these forms. Now, this is the archive of an artist, Nilima Sheikh, and what you see there is a line drawing of how squirrel hair brushes are made, right? And so this is something that for us was extremely sort of important to try and document, to understand. Nilima Sheikh, as an artist, just to quickly tell you, is somebody who uses, somebody whose work is inspired by a lot of manuscript painting, ranging all the way from Turkish painting to Persian painting, all the way to Chinese and Japanese murals. Her work is also one that sees a lot of citation, therefore, and stands through processes of tracing and stenciling and so on. So for us, the fact that a contemporary artist has built an archive of over 800 stencils, has built an archive of such an amazing range of visual and textual references was just mind-blowing. And so that was something that we tried to capture. As an artist, she herself was also somebody who used pigments. And this is not something, material histories like these are not things you find resources on. There hasn't been that kind of research done. And she was somebody who came with this knowledge, and this knowledge that came through decades of her practice on something as basic as natural pigments. And how do they, sort of histories of these pigments and their use, not just in art, but how are pigments used in everyday domestic use, for instance? How would something like whiting, which was used as a primer on manuscript painting paper, how would that be used to paint walls, for instance, in different parts of India? How would a pigment like green earth, terravert, how did that travel from, let's say, Buddhist caves in India to China along the Silk Road? How did, one find it in, let's say, Renaissance painting, and then how did it disappear all of a sudden in the subcontinent, and suddenly it came up again in the early 20th century? I mean, just the stories of such travels and all of these things were, and these are not available in the form of documents. So as an archive, what do? We're, of course, sort of we have these restrictions or limitations, let's say, as an archive, that if there is no document, well, then we have to try and produce one. And so we do this in the form of doing an interview with her and sort of putting together this, this history. An area of particular interest to us in the office in India is actually art writing. As I mentioned earlier, in a region that has 22 officially recognized languages, all of the writing on art, all of the discussion on art happens in English, right? And so we decided to set about doing something very simple. We started putting together a bibliography of writing on modern and contemporary art. And we decided to look at about 13 languages. That's it. And so just the sheer sort of fact of us sort of going from place to place, putting together this material was an amazing challenge, only because none of us know more than 2 or 3 languages at the most. So to sort of get in touch with a set of people who would be interested and capable of doing such a task was difficult but extremely inspiring, and something that we sort of are keen to continue. And what this also revealed to us was amazing challenges. I mean, the question of when was modernism is something that one thinks in the Indian context, at least, as having been resolved. But the moment you start entering the vernacular, modernism and everything starts becoming extremely blurry. And in the context of India itself, you realize that in one linguistic region, modernism begins like in the 1850s, but in another, it comes very late, possibly in the 1920s or 1930s. So, so all of these things were things that we started realizing, through the process of actually making something like a bibliography. And as part of our interest in art writing, periodicals also became a site that we were very interested in. Imagine a context where you do not have museums and the role that museums play in showcasing works, like you have in Europe and like you have in the US, right? Where do people see a lot of their work? Where do artwork exhibitions take place? They primarily take place on the pages of a periodical. That's where everybody sees and reads a lot of what's happening on art, from within the region, but also from outside. And therefore, we actually held a symposium early last year, which was called It Begins with a Story, where we brought together researchers and scholars from different parts of Asia looking at the role of the periodical, and of course, the space of art in it. The last thing that I wanted to say was also, while of course, as researchers at the archive, we build research collections. We have people who sort of organize programs around it, talks, workshops, etc. We're very interested in sort of seeing how artists respond to the archive. And so one of the things we had done, for instance, in India was to invite Shilpa Gupta, who's a contemporary artist who works a lot with sort of conceptual art. We invited her to the archive and we said, look, we've looked at Baroda, we've looked at this art school, it's amazing, we've got this amazing collection. She said, this is great, very good information, but she said, I'm not interested in these stories. I'm actually interested in more personal stories and relationships of individuals. What drives one person to move from one place to another? You know, it may be ideological, but it also may just be personal relationships that drive people to move. How does the archive capture that? And then we realized we actually had no way of, the archive had not captured that. And there was, in a sense, that limitation to what the archive could capture. And so she went about actually using the material we found we had already digitized, but also going about collecting more sort of material, but not just that, also conducting sort of interviews, speaking to artists and so on, and putting together, an installation for us. And what you see on the left over there, the graph, was actually a map. It was supposed to be a map of Europe that one of the artists had drafted. And this was of all the places in Europe that he had visited, and that map would be circulated or shared for almost 15 years by any artist from India who went to Europe would carry that map as sort of as a way of sort of plotting various sites. Now, the story was amazing for us, but the map unfortunately was lost. And I think it's very telling of how an archive, in its sort of drive to try and be comprehensive and all-encompassing, there's always something that it misses. There's always slippages, and there's always something that we will never find. And in that sense, the archive is always incomplete. And so I think it is through also, through inviting artists to collaborate, it is through sort of ensuring that the material that we digitize circulates, that people, sort of use it, whether in their own research, whether it is to sort of, make work out of it, artwork out of it, etc. The idea of preservation through dissemination is something that is very central to what we believe and what we work with at the archive. So the idea that we are not the gatekeepers and we are not the only people to whom one can come, that there will be, that the archive is something that lives on in the work of many people. And that is ideally how it should be, that we have to find nodal centers, we have to find other places and points where the archive can actually disseminate and live on, right? So with that, I think I will just end. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for such inspiring presentations. Much more than I could have even imagined, I must say. And there was so much, I think, almost in common, or almost I felt that in your presentation there were almost some responses to questions that that you, Graciela, were posing. Maybe one that kind of emerged while I was listening was that the approach of Asia Art Archive in essentially digitalizing and disseminating while keeping the archives in their original place is a practice that I would encourage. and that feels like also responding to your question as to what to do in that situation. I mean, I guess the question of material preservation still stands, and maybe on that I would be curious to know, how you deal about it. I suppose there must be archives that might be in material danger as well, and maybe also what you actually think in relationship to their approach. I think you can use this one.
Yes, I mean, because we are a digital archive, all of the material that we do digitize remains with the people, from whose homes we have actually digitized all of this material. Of course, I mean, while digital archives have their own sort of infrastructural requirements, physical archives have an entirely different one. And what happens a lot, at least in a lot of the Asian context at least, is that there aren't as many institutions, public archives, etc., that are willing to, let's say, take in a lot of this physical material. So it's only with artists who have the wherewithal, who have the space to actually keep this material, that we've actually been able to find some of this material. I mean, the number of stories one has heard of artists who have, let's say, thrown away, a lot of this material is only too common. The state is also a slightly precarious option, I would think, in the context of India for several, and much of Asia for several reasons. One, of course, you never know what will happen to that material, when it gets there. Not just whether it comes to light, but if there is sensitive material, is that something you want to be handing to a state institution is something that one has to think about. So, it is a reality because, most of the artists whose archives we are digitizing, they're in their 70s and 80s. Not all of them have the wherewithal to sort of create a foundation or an estate and have them manage it, In all likelihood, a lot of this is in fact going to go away. And that is a sort of a reality of the context that we're in. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think digitalization and material archives are complementary in a way, and they are especially important, digitalization, for the sociabilization of the context of their contents. But I think also that the physical archive, the materiality of the archive is also important because there are a lot of things that are lost in digitalization. And also this necessity or this urge to maintain our archives in their own countries is also important because it's part of the patrimony, and if not, and I think it is important to resist this pressure of the market to take them away to the center, because it's always, and also because I think that it's not, it is to have the possibility of consulting the archives in their own places gives a notion or a knowledge of the context that you cannot have with a digitalization. But it is important, digitalization, to make a much more audience, a much more people to can know, to can consult them.
And is it, I'm also curious in terms of like copyrights or, also thinking about the future, because there's a lot of, privatization going on with archives as well, and, having to, it's a capitalization on archives as well, and having to pay also a lot of money to receive one material. Think about also what Google is doing in terms of archiving collections of museums. So what is that status in relationship to, because you are an archive of archives in that sense, in the most.
Well, because copyright rests with the physical material, unless one hands over the physical material, the question of copyright does not arise in our context. So we actually do not hold copyright over any of the material that we digitize. We take non-exclusive licenses from the artists whose archives we digitize for disseminating for free and educational purposes. I must say that it also leaves us slightly precarious. For instance, if an artist whose archive we've digitized let's say an artist passes away and, and he's either given over rights to, a private entity, or it comes to the family who decides they want to monetize it, and suddenly they say, take this material offline. We're actually in a bit of a bind. So, and I mean, the way we would like to deal with this is not by saying that we want copyright. That's not an option for us at all. However, I think what we therefore try and do is also to just make sure that we build good relationships with each of the individuals, because at the end of the day, it is a lot of their goodwill that allows them to sort of give this material over for digitization.
So, also from me, wonderful presentations. I'm really happy we invited you. I wanted to ask about the notion of situatedness, which you both evoked in your presentations. On the one hand, something you've written about, Sneha, which is the untimeliness of the archive, which might be understood or could be understood as the time unsituatedness of the archive. But at the same time, thinking of a physical archive which, thinks about specificities of geographical regions, but that are also kind of displaced and meet up in a certain place, be it Hong Kong. I would like you to talk about that a bit. And Graciela was also thinking about the notion of situatedness in the archive. When you gave the example of your colleague who buried the archive before leaving on exile. The two things that happened there I find quite interesting. The person who has the knowledge and who made was part in the construction of that archive disappears with that knowledge in him. But the archive is also somewhere, buried somewhere. So I don't know if you can talk about the situatedness of archive within these disparities.
Should I? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think the question of situatedness becomes really complicated, because on the one hand, there is the situatedness of context vis-a-vis the fact that material is online. As much as we try and provide context, it tends to lose a little bit of that situatedness, but it also gains other forms of it. So I think that is something that we find very interesting, because for, let's say, somebody based in Hong Kong, somebody who's looking at the history of Hong Kong, and sort of, discovers an artist archive there. I mean, in the local context of Hong Kong, the artist may have meant several things, but for somebody else, because they're seeing it online, maybe it generates something else, and it becomes part of then another, sort of network of sort of conversations and possible sort of discourses. And I think that is sort of something we at the archive are actually open to as well. I mean, that's something we personally are also very interested in seeing. Materials that may have at a particular point of time sort of circulated, in very specific contexts. What happens when we pull them out of that context into the present and throw them into, let's say, a different network? What happens to that same object or material or document then? So.
Well, I think it's a part of the dilemma or the problem, no? Because there are the readings or the of how to understand some document has to do with what questions one asks oneself, and I think context gives a really a different possibility of knowing other layers of significance. So I think I don't think it's like they are contradictory, but I think there are different approaches and different, that has to do with different ways of thinking, because there is the dangers of neutralizing and also of sometimes when you put into a digitalized, you digitalize these documents, sometimes you have to, or you are pressured to put it into certain codified ways of order, and I think that is not good for a certain kind of productions or works that are not do not enter in these grids or universal codes.
No, in that sense, I was curious to ask you even more specifically, like, do you think there is a danger, and maybe that is also for you, in excessive, in over-circulation, in excessive exposure? One that, by digitalizing and having everything online, of course, there also is no way to monitor, in a sense. So, yeah.
Okay, so at the archive, we deal with it in very specific ways. So when artists give us permissions to put things online, we actually don't have just one level of access. We have a range of them. So for instance, in the context of correspondence, now correspondence always involves two parties, right? So you need technically to get rights from both parties. So as a rule, and as a rule of thumb, we actually do not sort of put any correspondence online. It is something that we put on site, which means that one can either access it in New Delhi or in Hong Kong or in New York, and possibly some more universities. This is something which is still in dialogue. But even within that, let's say within a particular letter, say that there are some parts which are extremely personal and the artist is uncomfortable with actually making that even available on site. We actually have sort of ways of, also making sure that that material gets, So as much as we say, for instance, that we are a digital archive, that, I have to admit that, copyright becomes one of the main sort of reasons why we, have not yet been able to put a lot of things online. But also when it comes to some sensitive material that artists themselves do not want us to circulate. I mean, I can actually give you another quick example from, there was an artist who, as part of the living traditions of Indian art movement that I briefly mentioned, there was an artist who traveled to very interior parts of India, parts that in fact never even had maps. And so he actually hand drew sort of maps of these parts. And these are parts, and these are parts inhabited by indigenous populations. These indigenous populations are also they come into confrontation very often with the state. So when we digitized this, he actually requested us to not circulate it so much. I mean, for us, it was an amazing, visual. It was an amazing map. It said some things about his practice, and we would have loved to be able to circulate this image. But he actually said that, that may not be something politically very, right to do. So, yeah.
So we have 5 more minutes. I'll ask one question, and then we take 2 questions from the audience. I think that we can do that in 5 minutes. In Cameroon today, the sheer act of archiving is an act of subversion. It is, and as you mentioned, at the moment you were doing the archive, it was a form of resistance. And I would like you to say a bit more about that. But in that space of subversion, it's also something I find very interesting, which I would like to bounce on Sneha as well, which is what Kwan Sing Chen talks about in Asia as method, the notion of referencing, creating spaces where one can also circumvent, traditional, of more conventional ways of referencing, referencing each other, creating spaces where one can see each other, So maybe you can say something about that, starting from the notion of the resistance and subversion. Yeah.
I talked about resistance and also kind of subversion, because at the moment we preserved all these documents. It was, well, we were engaged in certain kind of production or cultural, we may say, kind of cultural activism. And so it was not only resistance to the power or to the circumstances and conditions of the context, but also against the canons of the art institution. And so many of almost all of the actions, the works we did in those times, they were not part of the art system, but after some years, now in about 50, these are part of the canon now, in a way. And so I think that is a very interesting thing, because now we cannot think of doing the same thing. And I think what the archives tell us or can give us is like references that traces, but not models, because to different contexts you need to have or to invent new strategies. And so I think that's why I speak of resistance to the models culture tried to impose on us, and that there is a need to subversion to those codes in art and in life.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that, Graciela, you mentioned canons, because one of the things that when we started off, at least working on archives in India, we actually started off with two of the most canonical figures in the field. And it was done for several reasons, which I won't go into right now, but they were extremely hesitant, right? And there was a lot of resistance to actually making a lot of that material accessible, because, and these are, because one of the things is that they have also had such control over how histories have been written of them and how they have been written into history as well. And so opening up their personal archive to, being put online would mean that they would lose, in a sense, that degree of control that they had. And so I think to that extent, what something like an archive putting online can actually do is, to also leave extremely canonical figures open to critique in ways I think people may not have had access to do so before.
So thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for coming over.
Thank you.